The rain came sideways across the vale that night, and Susannah Verrell was 40 feet above the flooded road with a rope burning through her bare hands, and she was not going to let go. The great hall of Cawdrey stood open to the November sky, had stood open for 14 months now, its rafters stripped, its stone walls drinking the weather. And the last tarpaulin was losing its fight with the wind. And 4 men below her on the scaffold were losing their grip on the canvas, and she could feel the whole enterprise sliding toward catastrophe, 1 wet inch at a time. She shouted down to them, not a lady's shout, not a request, a correction, sharp and specific, the way her father had taught her to give instruction on a sight. And 2 of them found a better grip, and the tarpaulin held for 1 more gust, and then the wind doubled, and the rope ran 6 inches through her hands, and she felt the skin go. A carriage had stopped on the road below. She did not look at it. She had no attention to spare. Then there were boots on the scaffold planking behind her, deliberate and unhurried, and a man in evening dress. She caught that much in her peripheral vision, the white of a cravat, the dark coat soaked through already, stepped up beside her and took the tail of the rope without asking. "Get off my roof," she said. "The knot is wrong," he said. She looked at the knot. It was wrong. She had tied it in the dark in the first minute of the storm, and she had known it was wrong and had not had a free hand to fix it. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. They held the canvas together for the next hour, hands overlapping on the wet rope, his bare, no gloves, the knuckles white with cold, while the wind came in 3 more waves, and the men below found their feet and the tarpaulin settled. When the storm finally dropped to a manageable complaint, she secured the rope properly, the way it should have been done from the start, and the man in the ruined evening coat helped her without being asked and without commenting on the first attempt. At dawn, he climbed down the scaffold, walked to his carriage, and left without giving his name. Susannah stood at the top of the scaffold for a moment in the gray light, her hands bleeding quietly at the palms, and watched the carriage go. Then she climbed down and went to see what the night had cost her. It had cost her 3 days of work and 1 length of new oak that had shifted in the wind and cracked against the wall. She stood in the mud of the forecourt and looked at the damage with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to count the cost before she permits herself to feel it. Toby found her there at 7, still in his nightshirt under his coat, and she sent him back inside for bread and told him to put his boots on properly this time. That was the 14th month. To understand how she had come to be on a scaffold in a November storm with a stranger's hands over hers and a ruined house above her head, you must go back 14 months further, to a solicitor's parlor in Harrowfield and to the sound of a roomful of well-bred people laughing. The will had been read on a Thursday morning in September, and the solicitor, Mr. Aldous Fenn, had delivered the operative clause in the tone of a man who is very sorry about the weather and can do nothing about it. The room held perhaps a dozen people. Nathaniel Verrell, Alaric's nephew, lean and composed at 33 in a coat that had cost more than Susannah's quarterly housekeeping. 2 of Alaric's sisters, who had never spoken to her directly in 18 years of family dinners. A clergyman, and several county men whose names she had always known, and who had always looked past her shoulder when they spoke. The clause ran as follows: that Cawdrey Hall and its farm, together with all appurtenances, were left to Alaric's wife, Susannah Verrell, née Rowe, that she may at last have something to do with her hands, and that the property would pass in full to Nathaniel Verrell, residuary heir, if Cawdrey was not restored to habitable and genteel order within 3 years. The condition to be certified by 2 commissioners appointed by the Lord Lieutenant. Someone in the back of the room laughed first, then someone else, then the sisters, then the clergyman, who recovered himself quickly and looked at the ceiling, Nathaniel did not laugh. He merely watched her with the patient expression of a man who has already done his arithmetic. Susannah laughed too. Once, badly, the way you laugh when the alternative is something else entirely. Then she stood up, took the key from Mr. Fenn's desk before he had finished extending it, and walked out. She did not take a carriage. She walked the 2 miles to Cawdrey through the September afternoon, let herself in through the south door, the Verrell crest above it, carved deep in the keystone, a thing she had walked under for 18 years, and stood in the great hall with the sky above her where the roof should have been, and looked at what she had. She had the key. She had Toby, 9 years old and recently motherless, her brother Edmund's boy, in her care since the spring. She had her father's chest of tools, which she had kept through everything, which Alaric had called a piece of sentimentality. And she had, somewhere in the back of her mind, 14 years of site accounts kept at this very house when she was 21. And the knowledge that her father, Jonas Rowe, had rebuilt Cawdrey's West Range in 1798 and had done it properly. She hired Silas Wren first. He was 64 and had worked for her father for 30 years. And when she came to his door and told him what she meant to do, he looked at her for a long moment and then said he supposed he could manage half days. She told him she was offering half wages and full days, and he said that was fair enough. He brought 4 of Rowe's old men with him, men who had known her since she was a child on sight, who called her Miss Susannah still, who did not find it remarkable that a woman knew the difference between a scarf joint and a butt joint, because they had watched her learn it. The first winter was the worst of it. She roofed one range, the East Range, the smallest, before the cold made lime work impossible. And she and Toby and Silas lived in those 3 rooms through December and January, with a single working range and the wind coming through the gaps she had not yet reached. Toby did his lessons on a plank set across 2 sawhorses, and he did not complain about the cold, which told her more about what his last months with his mother had been like than she wanted to know. She kept the accounts by candlelight, and she did not allow herself to think about the rooms she could not afford to touch yet. She was thinking about the East Range's ridge beam, in fact, on the morning a neighbor called, Mrs. Hadlow from the farm at the edge of the Cawdrey land, and mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone delivering important news, that the man who had been on the scaffold in the storm was the Earl of Stanmore. Susannah put her pencil down. Gideon Merrick, Mrs. Hadlow said, chairman of the County Drainage Commission, widower. His abbey has been falling down for 15 years. They say he's been arranging its demolition in a gentlemanly way. That same afternoon, Nathaniel Verrell's first formal notice of contest arrived by post. A courteous letter from his solicitor, noting that the 3-year condition had begun to run and that Mr. Verrell wished it known he intended to monitor the progress of the works closely. She set the letter on the workbench beside the accounts and went back to the ridge beam. There was nothing else to do. In February, she sold her father's house in Larkfold. She had not decided to do it. She had decided to price the oak she needed for the East Range roof, and the price had decided everything else. The timber merchant in Harrowfield gave her a figure that was fair and impossible, and she stood in his yard for a moment, looking at the stacked oak and thinking about the Larkfold house, the room she had been born in, the window that faced the churchyard, the smell of the place. And then she told him she would be back within the fortnight. She completed the sale in a single morning. The new owner was a wool merchant from the north. She handed him the keys at the door, did not go inside again, and walked to the timber merchant with the receipt in her coat pocket and placed her order. She was back at Cawdrey by nightfall. She told Silas Wren what she had done that evening, standing in the East Range with a new candle she had bought because she was not going to economize on light when there was work to read by. Silas listened without interrupting, which was his way. "There's no going back from that," he said when she had finished. She agreed. "No. Your father would have done the same," Silas said after a moment. "He always said a man who keeps a door open isn't working. He's waiting." She looked at the candle flame. "He said that about other people. I don't know what he said about me." Silas picked up his mug and did not answer, which was also his way. She blew out the second candle to save it and went to check on Toby. She had sold the only property she had outside Cawdrey. There was no reversible decision left. Whatever happened here, happened here. She found, to her own surprise, that this was easier than the alternative had been. Gideon Merrick came to Cawdrey on a Tuesday in March, in daylight, in a plain coat, without announcement. She was on the West Range scaffolding when he arrived, and she climbed down because she recognized the set of his shoulders before she saw his face, the particular way he stood, which she had been looking at for 4 months in the dark of her own memory. "You were on my scaffold in November," she said. "I was," he said. "The knot was wrong." "I know it was. What do you want?" He told her about Stanmore Abbey's medieval range, the condemnation notice, the 3 London architects, the demolition estimate he had been managing toward for the better part of 15 years. He said it without embarrassment and without particular feeling, the way a man describes a situation he has made his peace with. "I want someone to look at it," he said. "Not a London man. Someone who knows how these buildings work from the inside. At night, if possible, away from county eyes." "You want a builder's daughter," she said, "where an architect would be noticed." He met her gaze without flinching. Yes. She considered him. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with the particular stillness of someone who is accustomed to being listened to and has stopped needing to perform it. His hands, she noticed, were not soft. There were the marks of real work on them, old ones, the kind that come from years of actually examining structures rather than merely commissioning reports on them. "I'll come Thursday," she said. After dark. Stanmore Abbey's condemned range was a 15th century undercroft with a timber-framed hall above, and she walked every foot of it by lantern light with Gideon 2 steps behind her and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. He did not press her. She tested the stonework with her knuckles, the way her father had taught her, the sound of hollow versus solid, the way the render moved under pressure. And she found what she was looking for in the northeast corner, where water had been running behind the plaster for 30 years along a cracked Lead Valley gutter that 3 London architects had apparently not thought to look at. "Your undercroft is sound," she said. "The hall frame wants 2 new principals, but the rest is serviceable. The gutter on the North Valley has been putting water into the wall since before the condemnation notice was written. Fix the gutter, repoint the north wall, replace the 2 principals. Your demolition estimate is wrong by a factor of 10. He looked at her in the lamplight. He did not say anything for a moment. "The London men said the structure was failing," he said. "The London men didn't look at the gutters," she said. "The structure is failing because the water has nowhere else to go. Take the water away and you have a building." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "How long?" 8 months if the weather holds. Less if you have good men." "Tell me what men you need," he said. Work began running in both directions after that. She advised on Stanmore. He appeared at Cawdrey with no stated reason and carried beams. He did not explain these visits, and she did not ask him to. He was useful, which was a thing she valued more than courtesy, and he knew when to take instruction and when to be quiet, which was rarer than it should have been. The incident in the West Range happened in April, on a morning when she was moving along a run of old joists to test each one before marking it for replacement. She had done this 100 times. The third joist from the north wall gave under her weight without warning. Not a crack, just a sudden absence of resistance. And she went through it to the knee before she had processed what was happening. Gideon's arm came across her from behind, hard and immediate, pulling her back against the wall, and he held her there with the arm across her chest while the dust came down and the joist settled below and the silence returned. She could feel his heartbeat against her shoulder blade. He released her a beat after the dust had settled, a beat after he needed to, and stepped back. And she turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything about it. "Mark that section," he said eventually. "I was going to," she said. The other moment came later, a night at Stanmore when she had brought Jonas Rowe's old site drawings to show Gideon the original construction sequence of the hall frame. They were spread across the workbench in the lamplight, and she was tracing the principal rafter layout with one finger. And he reached out and turned her hand over, palm up, in the light. He held it there and looked at it. The calluses at the base of each finger, the old lime burns across the heel of the hand, the rope mark still fading from November, for a long moment, without speaking. Then he set her hand down carefully on the drawing and looked at the page again. She did not sleep that night. Lying in the East Range with the new roof above her and Toby breathing steadily in the next room. And she did not allow herself to examine the reason why. Nathaniel's escalations began the following week. 2 of her lead men came to her on a Monday and resigned, both of them apologetic and neither of them meeting her eye. And she learned before the week was out that they had been offered double wages on a project in Harrowfield. A project that turned out, on inquiry, to be Nathaniel Verrell's new stable block, which had not previously been scheduled to begin until autumn. Then Silas came to her with the news that every lime kiln in the county had been contracted for the year. Every one. She stood in the lime store and looked at her remaining stock and did the arithmetic. Then she went to the workbench and found, under the drawings, the 1811 survey of Cawdrey. She had been through her late husband's papers methodically, because she was a methodical woman when the work required it. And the survey had been in a locked box she had forced in February. She had not looked at it carefully until now. It was a commissioner's survey, declaring Cawdrey Hall beyond economical repair and recommending no public expenditure on its preservation. It was dated 1811, and it bore, among the certifying signatures at the foot of the page, the name Gideon Merrick, in a hand she recognized from 9 months of shared drawings. She read the signature 3 times. Then she carried the survey to the workbench and set it in the center and waited. He arrived at Cawdrey an hour later. He had been coming most mornings now, without occasion, and she did not speak. She simply looked at the paper on the bench between them. He looked at it. She watched his face change. "Get out," she said. He went. 3 days passed. She worked through them without stopping for anything she did not have to stop for. And on the 3rd evening, Silas took the plane out of her hands and told her she was going to ruin the board and she should sit down. She sat down. On the 4th morning, Gideon returned. He came on foot, which she had not expected. He carried a letter, not his own, an older one, the handwriting unfamiliar, and he set it on the workbench beside the survey and stood back. "Alaric withheld your father's counter-report," he said. "Rowe submitted a rebuttal to the commission. It was never placed before us. This is the letter from the commission secretary. I found it in the county record office this week. It was filed under Verrell correspondence. She read the letter. She read it again. Her father had written 16 pages, rebutting the survey's conclusions, point by point, with measurements and material specifications, and a detailed account of every repair he had made to the West Range in 1798. The commission had never seen it. Alaric had seen to that. "You signed it without walking the building," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. He did not look away. "I was given a report and I signed it. I did not go and look. I have known for 9 years that I was used. I did not." He stopped. He tried again. "I told myself it was not my place to revisit a settled matter. I was wrong about that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a beam end from the stack beside the bench and held it out to him. He took it. He carried beams for the rest of the day. That was her forgiveness. She did not say so. He understood it. The Lord Lieutenant's letter arrived the following week, and it named Gideon Merrick as one of 2 commissioners appointed to certify the restoration of Cawdrey Hall at the 3-year term. She read it standing in the forecourt in the morning light, and felt the shape of the problem immediately. Nathaniel's letter arrived 1 hour later. It was courteous, congratulatory, and precise. It noted that Lord Stanmore had spent a considerable number of hours at Cawdrey in a working capacity, and that this involvement, given his appointment as certifying commissioner, represented a conflict that would render any certificate he issued voidable at law. It wished her every success with the remaining work. She sat with both letters on the bench until Gideon arrived. She handed him Nathaniel's letter without speaking. He read it. She watched him read it, and she watched the moment he understood. "I'll resign the commission," he said. "It passes to Nathaniel's man," she said. His jaw tightened. "Yes." "Then you've given him the certification and lost yourself the appointment." "I know what I've done," he said. He folded Nathaniel's letter and set it down. "We cannot be seen together. Not until this is finished." She looked at her hands, the lime dust in the creases, the rope mark still faintly pink on the left palm. "I know," she said. He left. She went back to work. She worked through winter into spring, alone in the sense that mattered, without him, without the particular quality of attention she had grown accustomed to, which she refused to name even to herself. Silas and the crew were there. Toby was there. The work was there. She rose before light and stopped after dark, and did not permit herself the luxury of thinking about what came after the deadline, because the deadline was the only horizon that existed. The vestry hearing came in March, 6 months from Michaelmas. Nathaniel had petitioned the parish vestry to declare Cawdrey Hall a dangerous structure abutting the highway, which would trigger a statutory order halting all works and, by forfeit, end the 3-year clause by default. His surveyor, a Mr. Dace from Harrowfield, testified at length about the lean of the west wall, its deviation from plumb, the cracking in the render, the risk to passing traffic. Susannah sat in the vestry in her working clothes. She had not changed. She had come directly from sight. And she listened to Mr. Dace for 20 minutes without expression. When he finished, the vestry chairman, Mr. Holt, invited her to respond. She stood up. "Mr. Dace," she said, "which way does the west wall lean?" Dace looked at his notes. "Away from the road," he said, "to the east." "And the plinth course, the base course, the lowest stone, is it level?" A pause. "I did not examine the plinth course specifically." "I see." She reached under the bench and lifted 2 lengths of oak onto the vestry table. One old, black with age, the grain compressed and dense. One new, pale, fragrant, the cut still clean. This, she said, setting her hand on the old piece, came out of Cawdrey's West Range roof. It was put there by my father, Jonas Rowe, in 1798. This, she said, moving her hand to the new piece, is what we are putting in its place. She looked up at the 80 people assembled in the vestry, tenants, tradesmen, farmers, 3 magistrates, Nathaniel in a new coat at the back. And she spoke plainly. My father built the west wall of Cawdrey in 1798. He built it on a slight batter, a deliberate lean, away from the road, into the hillside, because the ground on that side runs wet in winter, and a vertical wall on a wet clay foundation cracks. A battered wall distributes the load. The lean Mr. Dace described is not a defect. It is the design. The wall has stood on that batter for 27 years without movement, and it will stand for another 50. I can show you the plinth course, which is level, and I can show you the batter angle, which is consistent from base to coping, which is what a designed lean looks like as opposed to a failing one. Mr. Dace did not examine the plinth course. He measured the deviation and called it damage. Those are not the same thing. The vestry was quiet. Can Mr. Dace tell me, she said, the difference in batter angle between a deliberately inclined wall and one that has moved under load? Mr. Dace could not answer. Nathaniel lost the petition publicly before 80 witnesses in the vestry of a parish where his family had held the pew for 4 generations. He left without speaking to her. She saw in his face, as he went, that he had decided something, that the law was no longer the instrument he intended to use. The leat above Cawdrey was opened on a wet night 3 weeks later. She woke to Silas pounding on her door at 2 a.m. and the sound of water she could not account for. And she went down to the undercroft in her nightgown with a lantern and found the lime store ankle-deep and rising. They worked through the rest of the night to save what they could, and by morning they knew the damage. 3 weeks of completed mortar work dissolved, the entire mortar stock ruined, the undercroft floor needing to be relaid. 7 weeks remained on the claws. She stood in the flooded undercroft in the gray morning light and looked at what was left. 7 weeks, Silas said beside her. I know, she said. It's not enough, he said. He said it gently, because he was a gentle man, but he said it. She held his gaze steadily. I know. And she went upstairs to start the accounts. Toby's fever came on the 2nd night after the flooding. He had been in the cold water helping them bail, and she had not sent him back to bed soon enough, and she knew it. And she sat with that knowledge through the 1st night as his temperature climbed. By the 3rd night, the fever was high enough that she had stopped sleeping and was simply sitting beside his bed with a cloth and a basin and the particular quality of attention that is indistinguishable from prayer. She heard the horse in the yard at midnight, then Gideon's voice below, speaking to Silas, then his boots on the stair. He came in without knocking. She had left the door open for air, and he looked at Toby, and then he looked at her. And he sat down on the other side of the bed and did not say anything. He was breaking his own rule by being here. She did not tell him to leave. They sat on either side of the boy through the small hours, handing the cloth back and forth when it needed wringing, and the fever climbed to its peak at 3, and then, slowly, reluctantly, the way fevers yield, began to drop. At 4 a.m, Toby's breathing changed from labored to merely deep, and she felt the change in her whole body at once. Every muscle that had been held rigid for 3 days releasing together. Her head went down onto Gideon's shoulder without any decision being made about it. He did not move. Not for an hour, not for longer. She was aware of his hand coming to rest, very carefully on the arm she had braced against the chair, not holding, just present. And then she was asleep. She woke to morning light and an empty chair beside her, and the sound of Gideon in the kitchen below making something hot, and Toby's eyes open and clear and demanding to know if there was bread. Nathaniel came alone at midnight, 4 days later. She heard the knock and went down with a candle, and found him at the south door, alone, no carriage visible on the road, his coat plain. He was carrying a leather case. "Mrs. Verrell," he said, "I have come to make you an offer." She let him in because it was midnight, and she wanted to know what it was. He set his papers on the workbench and laid them out with the precision of a man who has rehearsed the arrangement. The gatehouse for her life. A full life tenancy, not revocable. A small annuity, enough to live on without the work. An apprenticeship for Toby at a good firm in York. And then, at the bottom of the case, a letter in a hand she recognized. Alaric's hand, the cramped, deliberate script she had read for 18 years, which Nathaniel laid on the table last, gently, like a card he had saved. She read it. It was Alaric's last letter to Nathaniel, written in the final weeks of his life. It described the will clause in detail. It used the word joke in the second paragraph. It predicted, with the casual confidence of a man who knows his audience, that she would be begging for the gatehouse by Michaelmas. It said her father would have been ashamed of her reaching above herself, and that the county had always known it. She read her dead husband's handwriting at 1 in the morning, in a house with no roof over half its rooms, with 7 weeks remaining and no mortar stock and no lime source, and 2 lead men gone, and the candle burning down on the workbench between her and the man who had come to take it all away. She held the pen Nathaniel offered her. She looked at the gatehouse papers. She set the pen down. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Good night." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then he gathered his papers, left Alaric's letter on the table, deliberately, she thought, and went. She did not sleep. She sat with the letter until the candle burned to its socket, and then she lit another. And then she went down to the flooded undercroft at first light to see what, if anything, was still worth saving. The water had dropped overnight. She moved through the undercroft with a lantern, testing the floor, checking the remaining stock, cataloging the loss. At the north end, where the water had been deepest, it had stripped the render from the West Range plinth in a long pale strip. She held the lantern close. Her father's mason's mark was there. The row mark, the double-barred R with the horizontal stroke, which she had seen on a dozen buildings across the county, cut clean into the stone at the base of the wall. And beside it, smaller, almost shy, 2 initials, SR, her own. The ones she had cut there herself at 9 years old, when her father had handed her the chisel and steadied her hand and told her that a builder puts their mark on what they build. And she had pressed the letters into the stone with great seriousness and enormous pride. She had not known they were here. She had not known he had kept them. She sat down on the wet floor of the undercroft and looked at her initials in the stone for a long time. Then she went upstairs and wrote a letter to Ambrose Peck, her father's old clerk in York, and asked him one question she had never thought to ask. What did Jonas Rowe hold against Cawdrey Hall? She sent the letter with the morning post. Then she went to find Silas and tell him they needed to talk about lime. Gideon arrived at dusk, on foot again, with a leather document case under his arm. He came into the hall and set the case on the workbench and opened it and stood back. She looked at the papers. They were surety papers, a formal instrument of security, signed and witnessed. pledging 300 acres of Stanmore land as surety for her accounts with the timber and lime merchants. Every merchant in the county had closed her credit. Gideon had mortgaged a significant portion of his own estate to open it again. She read every line of the papers. She read them twice. The hall around her was unroofed at the east end, the sky above going from amber to gray, and the air smelled of wet stone and sawdust and the particular cold that comes before a clear night. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression she had come to recognize. The one that appeared when he had done the thing and was waiting to discover whether it was the right thing, having no words ready for either outcome. She crossed the hall, set both hands flat against his lapels, lime-dusted, damp from the undercroft, and kissed him once, deliberately, the way she did everything that mattered. He was very still for a moment, and then he was not still at all. And when she stepped back, his lapels bore the clear white prints of her hands on the dark wool. He looked down at them. "You'll want to brush those off before you're seen," she said. "I won't," he said. He wore them to a magistrate's dinner 4 days later and let them be noticed, and said nothing about them to anyone. Michaelmas arrived on a morning of thin autumn sun, and Cawdrey's forecourt held more people than it had seen in 20 years. The commissioners were there. Hollis Trant and his colleague, both in good coats. The vicar. 3 magistrates. Silas Wren and the crew, clean-faced and straight-backed, standing together at the east wall. Nathaniel Verrell in a new coat, near the south door, with 2 men from his solicitor's office flanking him. Tenants from the farm. Half the parish, it seemed, come to watch the resolution of a story they had been telling for 3 years. Trant read his report. The West Range, complete. The North Range, complete. The Great Hall, habitable and in good order. The East Range, open to the sky at the far end, the roof unfinished. The condition as written in the will, requiring habitable and genteel order throughout. He set his papers down and looked at Susannah and said, with the careful neutrality of a man doing exactly what he was paid to do, that the condition had not been met. Nathaniel stepped forward. He spoke briefly and pleasantly. The clause was clear, the commissioner's report was clear, and he was prepared to take possession of Cawdrey in an orderly fashion, with due respect for all current arrangements. Then a post-chaise came through the gate. Ambrose Peck was 71 and had made the journey from York in 2 days, which had not been good for him. And he came into the forecourt moving carefully, but carrying his leather case with both hands, as though it contained something he would not set down for any reason. He asked for the commissioners, and they identified themselves, and he opened the case. The 1798 bond was a single sheet of heavy paper, folded twice, with a wax seal still intact on the outer face. Peck read it aloud in a voice that had spent 50 years in legal rooms and knew how to carry to the back of a crowd. The bond was between one Edward Verrell, Alaric's father, and Jonas Rowe, master builder of Larkfold, for the sum of £4,200, being the full and agreed consideration for works completed at Cawdrey Hall in the year 1798, secured on the property of Cawdrey Hall and its farm. The bond had never been discharged. 22 years of interest at the agreed rate had accumulated on it. The schedule of interest, which Peck then produced, ran to a second page. The total sum now owed to the estate of Jonas Rowe, sole heir, Susannah Rowe, by her maiden name, as specified in her father's own will, exceeded the current market value of Cawdrey and its farm, by a margin that made the forecourt go very quiet. Nathaniel's solicitor's man opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he looked at his colleague. No condition Alaric had written into his will could burden a property that Alaric's own father had mortgaged to another man 22 years before, a property that did not stand free, that had never stood free, that had stood charged to the estate of Jonas Rowe since the year Alaric inherited it, and which Alaric had known this when he wrote the clause, and had written it anyway. The legal position collapsed quietly and completely, the way a wall collapses when the keystone goes, not with drama, but with a kind of terrible inevitability. Then Gideon Merrick stood up. He was standing with the tenants, not with the commissioners, and he stood up without being called upon and without preamble, and the forecourt went quiet in a different way. "I signed the 1811 survey of Cawdrey Hall," he said. His voice was level and carried easily. "I certified it as beyond economical repair. I did not walk the building before I signed it. I was given a report and I appended my name to it without examination, and that document was used for 9 years to justify the neglect of this house and to make a laughingstock of the man who built it. I have spent 15 years describing that decision as prudent stewardship. It was not. It was cowardice with a better name. I am naming it correctly now." No one spoke. Gideon did not look away from the assembly. "Jonas Rowe's counter-report to the commission was suppressed by the then owner of this estate," he said. "It was never placed before us. I did not ask whether there was a counter-report, because I did not want to be a man who had to fight for something. The survey that bears my name was wrong. The building it condemned is standing. I thought the county should hear that from me directly." He sat down. The quiet that followed was the kind that descends when a crowd of people must revise their understanding of the last 15 years all at once. Then Susannah said, clearly and in front of everyone, "I will not enforce the bond against the wider Verrell estate. Mrs. Verrell and her daughters keep their income. Nathaniel Verrell keeps what is properly his." She looked at Nathaniel, who was standing very still near the south door, and she said, "I take Cawdrey, nothing more." She took her father's mallet from her coat pocket. She had carried it there since morning, and his chisel, which she had sharpened the night before. She climbed the 3 steps to the south door. She set the chisel against the Verrell crest in the keystone, and she began to work. She worked for 11 minutes. She worked the way the work is done, not in anger, not in haste, clean cuts, the right angle, letting the tool do what it was made to do. The crest came away in 3 sections and a quantity of fine dust. She climbed down and stood back. Silas Wren and 3 of the old men brought up the replacement stone, the one she had cut herself 2 weeks ago, working by candlelight in the East Range when Toby was asleep. They set it in the south door keystone with new lime mortar, Toby handing up the boards from below, serious and careful, not spilling any. The stone read, the Rowe Mason's mark, the double-barred R, the word Rowe, and the year. The county stood in the forecourt and watched a woman put her father's name above the door of the house that had tried to erase him. And no one laughed. That night, the first fire burned in Cawdrey's great hearth in 20 years. Silas had laid it in the morning, just in case, and Toby lit it with the solemnity of a boy who understood that something was ending and something else was beginning. The men and their wives came in and ate and drank and stayed until the evening was late. And then they went home, one by one, with their coats and their lanterns, and the forecourt emptied, and the house settled into a quiet it had not known for a long time. Silas was the last to go. He stood at the south door and then looked up at the new keystone and then at Susannah, and he said, "Your father would have liked that," and went without waiting for an answer. She bolted the south door from the inside. Gideon was banking the fire in the great hearth, adding the last 2 pieces of oak with the economical care of a man who has spent time around working fires and knows how to make them last. She stood in the doorway of the hall and watched him, and he looked up, and neither of them needed to say anything about any of it. 1 year on, Cawdrey was a working house. 4 apprentices lived in the North Range, Toby among them, the youngest by 2 years and the most particular about the quality of a scarf joint. And the county's gentry had discovered, with the particular surprise of people who should have known better, that a woman who could save a roof was worth more than one who merely owned the house beneath it. Stanmore's condemned medieval range stood dry and sound, by Susannah's method, at a fraction of the demolition estimate, and 3 neighboring estates had written to ask about the gutter work. She and Gideon had married quietly in Larkfold Church in April, on a morning when the apple trees in the churchyard were just coming into leaf and the building smelled of old stone and new candles. He had asked her, the week before, whether she intended to recut the keystone with the married name. She had looked at him. He had said, before she could answer, that he hoped she would keep it as it was, that Roe was the right name for that door, and that he would like to be a man who lives under it. She had not had to think about it for very long. The east window had been re-leaded in June. New lead, old glass where it was salvageable, new where it was not. And the morning light came through it now in long pale rectangles that moved across the floor as the sun climbed. On the sill below the window, where she had set it down the morning after certification day and not moved it since, her father's chisel lay with the morning light on the handle. 2 coats hung on one peg by the south door, hers and his, overlapping at the shoulder, the way things settle when they belong in the same place.